Okay, econ students, so we're going to talk about kind of the second half of what we need to know about exchange rates. This is going to be a really quick introduction, just a couple of slides here. And in fact, there's more slides online that you can access, but we're just going to talk about the first two or three in the example that goes along with it. And so here are kind of your most important things to know, and really all I'm going to talk about in this video is number one. The most important thing to know is that when a currency appreciates, that will decrease net exports for that country. So if the dollar gets stronger, if the dollar buys you more yen, more pesos, more euros, right? If a dollar buys you more, then net exports for the United States will decrease. And the opposite of this is also true. When a currency depreciates or a currency loses value, then net exports will increase. We'll talk about exactly why that is in just one moment. The other things you're going to find in these slides that you should look at, and there will be some future quick recordings on, you should understand purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity is one of the driving factors between this concept of currency valuation and imports and exports and trade. Purchasing power parity, or PPP, is also sometimes called the law of one price. And so go check out the next set of slides after this that'll introduce you to that and look at the kind of worked proofs or practice problems of why that happens. And then the last thing that is super valuable both in this lesson and overall is understanding a general concept that the kind of nominal exchange rate, or the dollar value, or the value of a dollar in an exchange rate, doesn't really matter. But the change in the value of a dollar does matter. And so here's your really quick kind of overall explanation of that, right? If $1 buys me 100 yen, that concept by itself doesn't mean anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that the dollar or the United States is a better economy than Japan or vice versa. But it does matter if that value changes, especially if that value changes suddenly, right? So if we're used to a relationship where $1 buys us 100 yen, but suddenly $1 only buys us 50 yen, or suddenly $1 buys us 500 yen, then the change in the value of a currency is what matters. And so this actually applies back to lesson one. The kind of numerical values of currencies don't matter, but it's the change. When a currency suddenly increases in value or a currency suddenly decreases in value, that's when we have to start paying attention. So here is your explanation of why exchange rates affect net exports. Right? Let's assume that $1 buys you €1. It's a 1-to-1 exchange rate. The dollar and the euro are worth exactly the same in the exchange rate model. And that a shirt in the United States costs $50 and the same shirt costs €50 in Europe. So the logical question here is, well, what does that mean, or what would that tell us about trade? And really what we can say is that it really wouldn't matter where people buy their shirts. If you were in the United States, you could buy your shirt in the United States and you would be able to buy it for $50, or you could trade your $50 in, turn your $50 into €50, and you could buy the same exact shirt in Europe. So the cost of the shirt to both Americans and Europeans is identical wherever we go. But what happens when the exchange rate suddenly changes? For example, what if the United States dollar were to appreciate? That means it buys us more euros. And we'll use an example. What if a United States dollar is suddenly worth €2? Right? So that means the dollar has doubled in value and the euro has lost half its value. How does this change the shirt buying dynamic, or the shirt buying incentives that we just saw? The answer is that Americans would suddenly want to buy their shirts in Europe. An American could spend $50 to get one shirt, or they could spend $25 to get €50 and get the same shirt from Europe. That would seem like a really easy solution. Americans would save their money by buying their shirts from Europe because the euro is now less valuable and because the dollar is now more valuable. Americans would feel relatively rich looking at things around the world. Meanwhile, Europeans, of course, would feel the exact opposite. Europeans would find it very hard to buy an American shirt. If a European was previously used to buying their shirts in America, maybe just because they liked the brand name or something like that, they would now need 100 euros in order to get the same $50, right? So they would need 100 euros. 100 euros would become $50. That would let them buy the shirt. It would be hard for a European to buy an American shirt, and most Europeans would stop buying American shirts. You also saw this in the article about the value of the dollar versus the euro that was attached before this lesson that hopefully you looked at. This is an especially powerful incentive changer when it comes to vacations. If you were planning in this scenario, if you were an American planning to go to Europe and suddenly the dollar increased in value more, then you would find yourself feeling very wealthy. Your $500 budget in the United States would suddenly buy you 1,000 euros worth of things, and that would be more than you thought. Meanwhile, a European would be in the opposite mode. They would be bringing their 500 euros to the United States, and their 500 euros in the United States would suddenly be worth half as much. It would only be worth $250, and they would be feeling very strapped or very kind of tight in terms of the amount of money they have to spend. Right? So what do we get if we look at this kind of middle section again in terms of conclusions? Right? What we get is that as the US dollar appreciated, Americans were incentivized to buy more things from Europe, which means US imports increase, and Europeans were buying fewer things from the United States, which means US exports decrease. So, conclusion in the highlight here, as the dollar appreciated, net exports minus imports for the United States would decrease. And Europe, of course, would find the exact opposite to be true. The euro depreciating would decrease imports. Europeans would not buy American things, but increase exports as more Americans buy European things, and the depreciation would help Europeans. That's a big, long, complicated way to get back to one very simple understanding, right? When a currency appreciates, the goods and services from that country look more expensive, right? So when the euro depreciated and the dollar appreciated, European goods looked less expensive and US goods looked more expensive, and that applies to people in both countries. Therefore, appreciation will decrease net exports and hypothetically will decrease real GDP. Americans will buy more European goods, Europeans will buy fewer American goods. Right? And therefore, a currency depreciation does exactly the opposite. The depreciation means that Europe feels the opposite effect here. Right? And this does lead to something that will show up in later slides that you don't need to think too much about, but hypothetically that means that a lower currency value is better for your economy, because a lower currency value means that your country will be able to export more. We see China really frequently accused of this. China is frequently accused of keeping their currency cheap, and by keeping their currency cheap, it makes their goods look cheap to the rest of the world. American companies not only can't compete with Chinese prices in many ways and Chinese wages in many ways, but they also can't compete with the fact that exchange rates make it hard for people around the world to buy American goods, but make it very easy for people around the world to buy Chinese goods. So currency value can have an impact then on GDP. So here is our kind of final keep it simple understanding, right? Currency appreciation decreases net exports, aka it decreases the current account, and it increases trade deficits. A decrease in net exports is a trade deficit. Currency depreciation increases net exports, which is an increase in the current account and an increase in the trade surplus when we have more exports than imports. So that is the single biggest thing I need you to know this week and need you to think about this week. Go back and look at the rest of these slides that appear later about purchasing power parity, and we'll do a little article evaluation and some marketplace evaluation to round things out for the week.